Hey, this is Zeke from CodeForDesigners.com. I'm here with another Level Up Friday. Level Up Fridays are free videos designed to help you improve as a coder over the course of your lunch break. Today, we're going to talk all about animating form fields. Before we start coding all of this up, let's actually sketch it out and think about how this is going to work. Now, I think it's probably best to think of this as a series of layers. On the bottom layer, you're going to have a form field. That's what the user is going to be able to type into to, in this instance, we're going to ask for their name. And above that, you're going to have a label. And then that label, when the user clicks into the form field, will slide out of the way, and you'll see the user will be able to type a little bit better. Once the user clears their text away, the field will reset back to that initial view. Let's start making this together in CodePen. It's a free service that lets you code right in a browser. They're not a sponsor, but I do genuinely love using this service. Now, in the description, you're going to find links to both the starter and finishing pins. Please go ahead and just clone that starter pin. If you want to tweak it and add your own text styles, feel free. I really want you to personalize this as much as possible. I'm just using the starter file so that we can move quickly, because I want to be able to get this done in your lunch break. When I work on stuff like this, I like to work in sequence. I want to start by making great HTML first, then jumping into styling using my CSS, and finally then adding my functionality through JavaScript. That sequence for me as a designer makes a whole lot of sense. I've got my bones in place, and I can make them look good, and then finally I can deal with what's typically the hardest thing for me working in JavaScript. So first, let's dive into the HTML. The first thing we need to do is make our input. Let's just make that input a type of text. No need to get too fancy. The next thing we're going to do is actually just add our label. And again, we're just looking for a person's name, so we're just going to add your name into the label. Now, to connect these two fields together, you have to use an ID and for attribute. So if you'll see when I try to click on the label right now, I'm just clicking away here, nothing really happens besides selecting the text. Now if you do this right, and you say for, and I'm just going to say this is for field name, and I'm going to give my input an ID of field name. You'll see now when I click on your name, that label now activates the input. I can tell that these things are connected together. In this example, we're obviously not sending data to a database, but if we were, we'd need the name attribute. And I'm just going to put full name in there for now. Great. Now, that's really all the HTML markup I need for good, strong, semantic HTML. But we know we're going to make this a component, so let's start doing that right now. The first thing I'm going to do is just wrap everything in a div called field. That's going to be our component name. You know me, I like BIM, so I'm also going to go ahead and use BIM to componentize the rest of this. So we've got field label, and let's call this field input. That's all we really need for our HTML. Now let's go ahead and start making it look good by adding some CSS styles in place. When I open up my CSS panel, you're going to notice that I have a few styles already in place. Some of these are just a few colors. One thing to note is I have switched the box model to border box. Other than that, these are just a few basic styles to help speed along our process. One of the first things I want to do is actually center our field inside of the layout, so that way we can actually see what's going on around the whole perimeter of this new input that we're creating. I have a style in place called L-centered. That's really just going to center everything for us. So let's just add that around everything. To get started with our component, I want to start styling the input first. I think that's going to carry the bulk really of our styles, so let's start with that. The first thing I'd like to do is actually just reset the line height. I don't have a CSS reset in place, which usually takes care of this, so I want to make sure that I know exactly what that height's going to be. I'm also going to go in and set my padding. Now, we're going to probably need a little bit more padding than normal because this field is going to contain a label and some inputted text. But for now, I'm just going to see if that kind of feels right. Of course, let's style our border as well. And I actually have a border color picked out already in a CSS variable. You'll see that that's up here. Great. And last but not least, I think what I want to add is a little bit of a box shadow. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a tiny shadow so it doesn't feel like it's floating too far above everything. Let's call it 0. Maybe move it down 2 pixels. And I nearly forgot to give it a blur. Blur of 3 pixels. And let's see, RGBA. This is going to give us some, sort of transparency to the shadow. Oh, it's not bad, but we can kind of fudge that around a little bit. Maybe I want to move it off a little bit less. Maybe I want it a little lighter. That's starting to feel okay to me. There we go. So the input has a few states that we can actually work with. We can show what happens when a user hovers above it. We can show what happens when a user kind of clicks into the field. How does that field look? So let's go ahead and work with that a little bit. I'm just going to copy the field input name. Let's actually deal with hover first. When a user hovers above this field, what I want to do is just change the border color. I have a color that's, I would use for links or something called active of up here. So let me just go ahead and grab that. That's in place. So now we can see it changes when we hover. Now what happens when we're actually inside of the field? We can see this very blue border, which is okay. That's kind of the standard built-in way for it to be handled. I want to make it look a little different, so let's go ahead and just deal with that. That's called the focus state. And so the browser itself always builds in that outline. You can see that big blue blur went away. But what I want to do is actually just kind of change the box shadow. So I want to make it feel like it's come off the page just a little bit more. Let's see what happens. It's subtle, but you can see the difference. Great. Those states are fine, but I want to make it feel good. I want to add a little bit of animation or transition in between those states so that it feels like it's glowing slowly, not just popping in and out. So on my field input, just give us a little bit more room. I'm just going to add a transition. And because I'm going to transition multiple properties, I think what I'm going to do is actually list these out separately. So transition property accepts multiple properties. So I'm going to do border color and box shadow. Transition timing function, which is effectively our easing. I'm just going to say ease in out for now. And I don't think that's, well, let's come back to it. I don't think that's how the browser writes it. Let's see, transition duration is the last thing we want. And let's just call it like 0.2 seconds. You never really want that to be too long. Oh, perfect. Okay, we're getting the easing we're looking for. So ease in and out, that's working. And you can tell because it's not the straight sort of linear ease. And it's happening pretty quickly. Right. And one thing I notice is when we mouse out, I kind of want that border color to stay while it's in focus. So let's make sure we add that. And I'm just going to duplicate that right now. Great. Well, there's one last thing I want to do. I just want to set the width of our input to 100% so that it occupies the full space of the container. And that's perfect. The thing that's centering my layout is also restricting the maximum width to 400 pixels. That's what I'm looking for. The next thing I want to do is actually float that label above the input. To do that, the first thing we're going to need to do is actually set position relative on our field. Oops, tiny typo. Position relative. That's going to restrict the context of our positioning to field itself instead of the entire document. Now we can absolutely position our label. I know I want to vertically center this, so let's start by doing that first. There's a little vertical centering trick where you can tell it to go down 50%. That 50% is relative to the field itself. And then you can transform using the translate property. And I'm just going to do the y minus 50%. And that 50% is going to be relative to the label. The next thing I want to do is actually make our label look like it's positioned well. When a user is typing, you see where their input starts and where our label is. That's because we have this padding set here. I'm just going to take that padding and actually move it into a variable on field. And let's set that. I'm just going to call it horizontal pad. Horizontal pad. Difficult enough to say, even more difficult to spell sometimes. I'm just going to copy that and first replace that here where I took it from, horizontal pad. And then also add it here. Oops, too many undos. Let's add that here. Great. So now you can see when the label and the user's input are aligned. That's great. That's kind of what we're looking for. Last but not least, let's actually deal with the styling of our text. One of the things I'm going to do is just reset the line height right now because I know I'm going to need that in the future. Then I want to set my text to a bit of a lighter color. Let's see if we have a variable for that. We don't. So, we could pretty much do anything at this point. I could see if that border, matching the border color would be good. I don't feel like that would. I think it's too light. So I'm just going to kind of fudge the number and make it myself. That looks good enough to me for now. I'm also going to change it so that our font style is italic. That'll help the user notice that that's not their input. It's just something waiting for them. It's looking pretty good, so it's time to prep for doing our animation. Now, there's two approaches generally to doing animation on the web. One is to either use JavaScript to toggle some CSS classes. The other is using JavaScript itself for the animation, typically with an animation library. our animations are pretty simple for this exercise. So I'm just going to take the first approach and use CSS classes and just toggle them using JavaScript. To do that, we need to first add some classes to our CSS to handle the look when our user has clicked into the field and started typing some stuff. So I'm going to add a class called hasData to both the label and to the input itself. First, let's style the label. When the label has data, one extra dot than what I actually need, we're going to slide that label up. So the first thing we want to do is reset our transform. So let's just kill that to 0. Translate y 0. Great. The other thing we want to do is now take our top and change it. I'm not incredibly sure what this number needs to be yet because this is really going to rely on the design. So I'm going to just put 6 pixels in here temporarily because remember the user is going to need room underneath this to type. The other thing I'm going to do is actually change the size of our font to 12-ish pixels, still readable, but smaller. That looks okay for now. So what we're going to do now is actually just go down to that field input and make a couple of changes because as you can see, this doesn't quite feel right yet. That spacing is off. So when it has data, what we want to do is move the text down without changing the size of the field. Now, we could do that math ourselves, or we could let CSS do it for us. I don't know about you, but I'm going to let CSS do it for us. So what I'm going to say is, actually before I start typing that padding, what I'm going to need is this number. And I'm going to move it into a variable so that way I don't have to think about it. We'll call that vertical pad. Let's take that vertical pad, copy it, we'll replace it here so you see our padding is the same. Now I can start working with my hasData. So padding top, for vertical pad, and I'm just going to copy that to the bottom. And now what I want to do is calculate sort of an offset. I'm going to shift these numbers by a fixed amount. So I'm actually going to add that as a variable up here called offset. And right now let's call it 6 pixels. I really don't know what it's going to need to be. We can make that adjustment on the fly. So let's do a calculation. So on the bottom, what we want to do is subtract our offset. And on the top, we actually want to add our offset. Oops. Our offset. So let's see if that's working. The test, I'm going to give it a very big number, like 12. And that's not working. And so if you're wondering why this isn't working, you may have noticed my earlier typo. Great. So let's play around with that offset. and see what it should be. 6 isn't bad. But I do want to move that label down a little bit. 8. And let's just put in some uppercase, some stuff with a drop or descender on it. Let's see how that feels. I think it's feeling kind of good. So this is about what I'd want it to be. Perfect. So that's what it looks like when field has data in it, but now we want to animate this using JavaScript. So let's first remove our has data classes from those fields. And let's slide open our JavaScript panel. Like everyone else, JavaScript for me can be a little intimidating. It's certainly not the easiest thing to work with at all times. But what's really helped me as a developer is first, before I start focusing on, am I writing this the best possible way ever? I just simply get it to work. That's really half the battle. Once you have that taken care of, go ahead and refactor it so that it's working and it's beautiful code. I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to start this off by first just listening for when we're ready to manipulate things with JavaScript, when our DOM is ready. So I'm going to add an event listener. And it's going to be called DOM content loaded. That's a built-in one. And then let's just have a function here. And this is where we'll do a lot of our work. So one of the first things I want to grab, I know, is going to be our field label. So I'm just going to call this label element. And I'm just going to use document query selector here. Now, document query selector is pretty cool. It works just kind of like CSS. You can use this dot notation to just grab a CSS class. Now, what I want to do is actually go in and create a new class called field label because I like having that JavaScript prefix. This helps other developers know that JavaScript is being used. And I want to do exactly the same thing with our field input. So like input element equals document dot query selector JS. And I know I'm going to call that field input. Let's just copy that name and add it. Great. Now, if we want to see if this is all working, right now the best way to do that would be to do a console log. And you can do one for label element. You can do another one for log for input element. This is helpful. I'm just going to right click now. You'll see that CodePen has a built-in console. And actually it logged it out, so you could see it there. Perfect. Now we need a hook to grab onto, something to listen to, so that we can begin to do our work. The event I want to listen to is actually on the input element itself. Listener. Ooh, almost misspelled that. So I'm going to add an event listener, and that event listener is going to be input. This is going to fire off anytime something changes. Anytime data changes without a delay. There's a lot of events that can fire. For me, I think this is probably the best one for our circumstance. Now, when that event is fired, what I want to do is go see if we have any, let's say any value. Yeah, we can actually ask that loosely. So we'll just ask if there's any value. If that comes back as true, which it would do in this case in JavaScript land, true would happen if there's any thing really besides a 0 or an empty string or the literal boolean for false. So this should work for us. And if that's true, what I want to do is add our class name. So I'm just going to add a constant. I'm going to call it class name because class is actually a reserved word in JavaScript. I'm going to say that classes has data. So let's add our class to the input element itself. Well, I'll use class list to do that. Add class name. I'm also going to do the same to the label element. And let's say class list add class name. And if it's false, we'll just do the exact opposite. Instead of calling add, we'll call remove. And remove. Great. Now, you can see I'm using some features of ECMAScript 6. So one of the things I want to do is go into the settings for JavaScript and actually just turn on Babel. Now, all this is doing is ensuring that every browser, ensuring that my JavaScript is cross-compatible with most browsers. I'm using Chrome to work on this. Chrome is, one of the leaders in the pack, so I don't think I'm using anything that Chrome wouldn't have, but just in case, let's just make sure Babel's running. Now we can check this, and you'll see it's working. You see it jumps out of the way. Later on, I want to come back and actually just make sure that, this is moving nicely. But first, I want to rewrite our JavaScript a little bit to make this actually really nice and work really well. Now, you may think it's working well right now, but actually the problem we're going to have is what happens when we have multiple fields on a page. Right? You'll see in this first one, it does what I expect. Oh, and let's change this to 2. Field name 2 for 2. But now when I try to click on the second one, it doesn't work. First one works, second one doesn't. And then you also see when we're kind of double clicking in here, we're selecting the name, but we really don't want to. So first, let's solve this sort of triple clicking into name. It's actually something we can address with CSS. So in the field label, all I need to do is go in here and just turn pointer events off. It's a CSS class. And now you see no matter how many times I click, and I'm clicking a lot, I won't be able to select that label. Great. Now, the second thing we want to be able to do really has more to do with JavaScript. All right, so how do we solve this? Well, a lot of this is really just going to be about rearranging some of the way we've written this code, making it a little more efficient. The first thing I want to do is actually just go ahead and let's basically copy all of this code and move it into a function called animate label. Great. All we need to do is loop over all of our components that get generated on on a page. So what I'm going to do is query selector all. And I'm just going to add a JS class called field. And for each of these fields, I'm just going to call animate label. So I'm just going to create a function inside of here. It's going to call animate label. Now, for each gives me each, I'm just going to call it field element. And so I can actually pass that field element to my label. So now my label is getting that field element. Now, instead of querying the document for this selector, I can actually just query the field element itself. And that really is all we need. You'll see it's working on both now. Now, one more thing we can do to make this actually even better is I didn't need to pass that manually to animate label. Actually, for each does that by default. So you'll see this is still working. Perfect, and it looks a little bit neater. That's it for our JavaScript. The last thing I want to do is let's first get rid of this duplicate field. And now let's actually work on transitioning that label as it moves up. We've already done this once, so it's pretty easy to do again. What we actually just need to do is transition a few properties. And I'm listing each property individually because all can be really destructive for the performance of your animation, especially when you have multiple things on the page. So it's best to specify these independently. The things I know we've changed are pretty much just right down here when the field has data. So we can list them. We've got font size, we've got top, we've also got our transform. And we can use the same transition timing function. If you remember, that was ease in and ease out. Oops, let's spell that correctly first. Ease in, out. And that transition duration, again, I'm just going to use 0.2 seconds. Now, I can move these to variables too, and I would suggest especially the time. It's appropriate to do that with. But you see exactly what we're getting. It just kind of shrinks where it should be. Pretty cool. We really wrote minimal JavaScript to make this happen. We didn't have to do anything too crazy, hopefully. But I hope you can see how this example of animating a label can be applied to a million other things that you're building. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out, either through the @CodeForDesigners Twitter or the Facebook page. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, please do. That helps me know that I'm creating content that you like. And most of all, happy coding.